I'm going to show you how to make a sourdough starter from scratch. Now I have a matured sourdough here as an example. So this is what we're going to make from scratch. And it takes about 5 days when you begin your starter from scratch, which means that if you start the process on Monday, by Friday you should have a sourdough that is active enough to bake bread with. Here are the ingredients for the first day. The first ingredient here is a dark rye flour. I scaled out my dark rye flour at 200 grams here, so you can see a little bit darker color. Okay, this is the whole grain of rye flour, which provides the necessary nutrients for the bacteria and yeast that we're trying to grow in our sourdough culture. And then next we take a water at warm temperature. I took this water at around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, so that way after mixing these two together, the dough temperature becomes about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, I'm going to scale the water into the flour. It mixes well from the bottom of the container to incorporate all of the flour, and at the end of the mixing, smooth the top surface. You can see that the mixture should have this soft, pasty texture. Check the temperature. Okay, it is at about 88 degrees, and mark where the volume is so that way you can monitor how much it rises. Okay, we're going to keep this in a warm environment, trying to maintain the 85 degrees temperature. Here is my proof box. Okay, I have a bucket of warm water, and inside there's just a metal bowl that is upside down. So this water will maintain the temperature of my culture. Okay, the water temperature is about 85 degrees, and I'll close the lid. So that way it insulates the heat, and also it takes a longer time to cool down. And you can refresh the water several times if it cools down. We'll leave the container like this overnight, and we'll check back tomorrow morning. Okay, so the water maintained a warm 85 degrees temperature overnight. I left this by the oven, so this is nice and warm still. And here is my culture. Okay, and on the side you can see some gas production. See a lot of little bubbles on the side. That's a good sign that yeast is being activated. Okay, so you don't see a lot of bubbles here on the surface, but once I stir it, you can see a lot of activity happening under the surface. I'm scaling my water. Now add my culture from yesterday. Okay, dilute the culture in the water first, and then add the flour that's being scaled out. Just like yesterday, smooth the surface, clean up the side, and mark the volume on your container. It will cover this and put this back into my low-tech proof box and maintain the same temperature at 85 degrees for the next 18 to 24 hours. This is day 3 on the sourdough culture elaboration, and this is the feeding from yesterday. Let's see how it looks like inside. You can see how much volume it increased. It looks like it came up to here and then fell in a little bit. There's plenty of gas production inside. I'm going to feed this culture twice today. It doesn't smell very good at this point. It still has that musty smell, but it should improve as I continue to feed. This is the feeding proportion for the first feeding of the day. Okay, so we're using half and half dark rye flour and white flour. So again, weaning off of the darker flour and using more and more white flour, which requires a little bit less water starting from this feeding because the white flour is less absorbent than the rye flour. And we're using the same proportion of the culture from day 2. Now I'm going to let this sit for about 8 hours, and then we will do a second feeding later today. About 8 hours after the first feeding. Okay, so you can see where we began and then how much it grows. Okay, plenty of activity here. I'm going to refresh at the same quantity as the first feeding. Okay, here's my new culture in a warm water bath again, and I will leave this at room temp overnight. Okay, this is what I mixed yesterday afternoon from the second feed of day 3. You can see the volume increase, it went up, it collapsed a little bit, looks like. Here's the inside. Okay, now the biggest difference today is that the smell is becoming a little bit more lactic, getting closer to what we want in our sourdough starter. Here's the feeding proportion for day 4. This is the first feeding of the day. So changing the proportion of the flours again, more white flour now than the dark rye flour. Equal part water to the flour, and then the culture percentage is the same. Okay, so this is how the flours look. Most of it is the white flour, and then the culture from yesterday's second feed. Okay, this is going back into the warm water bath again. Now, this culture is almost ready to use as a sourdough starter in bread baking. Indications that I'm looking for is that the volume should double in size in about 8 hours or so, and also it should create a sweeter smell, more lactic smell within about 8 hours of fermentation. So I'll be looking for those indications. Okay, so this is the afternoon of day 4. Here's the culture from the feeding in the morning. It has been about 10 hours. It's been a long day. But you can see how active the culture is. Okay, so my culture is now active enough that I can start feeding it as a sourdough starter. I no longer use the rye flour, just feeding with white flour, equal part water. And then I'm going to take 30% of the culture and then add it to this mix. I'm also not using the warm water anymore. Desired dough temperature after mixing is about 70 degrees or so, and I will keep the mixture at room temperature without the warm water. And I'm going to refresh twice a day from now on. We'll wait and see how it looks tomorrow morning. 5 of the sourdough culture elaboration. This is from yesterday afternoon. So there are all the indications that I'm looking for. The gas production here, the volume increase, and then the aroma too. Now it has a nice sweet, almost like yogurt type smell to it. So I'm going to start treating this as a regular starter. This is the quantities that I'm going to use for the maintenance feeding. If you're baking bread with this starter, then you will need to increase the quantities. This is before feeding, and this is just after the refresh that I did. If you're going to refrigerate your starter should look like this before going into the refrigerator. This stage has a lot more bacteria and yeast living in the mixture, so you have a better chance of reactivating after the refrigeration. Be careful not to make this quantity too small, as the smaller the mixture is, it's more difficult to maintain a good activity of the starter. Okay, and there are different factors affecting your starter activity. If you introduce darker flours like rye flour or whole wheat flour as a portion of your feeding flour, then it's going to increase your starter activity. Second is the percentage of your starter. Obviously, more starter you use in the feeding, then it's going to make it more active. Number 3 is the temperature of your starter, which can be controlled by the temperature of your water. But to make it more active, try to shoot for a little bit warmer dough temperature after mixing. So use these 3 factors as a tool to control the speed of fermentation of your starter.